Hi, I'm Marlene Graf, and I teach in the Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food Sciences department on the Logan campus. The name of this session is Teaching First-Year Students, Best Practices, and New Ideas. So let's get started. I like this quote from a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. They said that teaching is not really an extension of a career in which you have attained a high level of expertise. It is a whole new career, and having a firm grasp on the subject matter is probably less than half the battle. I think I resonated with this because this was my experience. As a student, I was trained to be a dietitian, and I worked in that field for a while. And then when I came to Utah State to teach, I felt like I was learning a whole new job. And so hopefully some of the things in this presentation will be helpful to you. The purpose of this session is to explore some evidence-based and experience-based examples of best practices and new strategies for teaching and reaching first-year students specifically. And that could be traditional incoming freshmen, but it could also mean non-traditional students who are returning to school. This session will also review current trends, characteristics, expectations, and concerns of today's incoming freshmen, and then offer supportive tips, tools, and resources to you. So here's an outline. First, I want to talk about why the first year of college matters, and then we'll discuss some characteristics of today's incoming freshmen and how that's different than previous generations. Number 3, we'll talk about some recommended teaching strategies and some new ideas that will hopefully be helpful. And then we'll end with some comments and feedback from first-year students that's intended for instructors. So here's part 1, why the first year in college matters. First-year students often come to college with a mix of hope, concern, apprehension, and also excitement. And for many, the challenges, opportunities, and experiences that they encounter during their first year become foundational and often predict whether or not they're going to continue in higher education. And so recruitment is important, but retention is just as important. And the things that happen during the first year often determine if they stay. So because of this, it can feel daunting if you're an instructor to teach courses that have a high percentage of first-year students or returning students, especially as we are in a highly technological post-COVID world, and strategies and approaches need to change. So I appreciated the insights in this blog post about why the first year matters. And for the sake of time, I'll just note that the link is here on this slide, and I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with anyone who would like it afterwards. But it mentions that freshman students often have the fewest course options, the largest class sizes, inadequate advisement, and less than ideal living arrangements. And yet, the first year of college is often the most important when it comes to retention. So one educator said this: if higher education wants to stay relevant for this generation of incoming freshman students, then faculty members must learn to tweak courses, redesign learning environments, and reevaluate their approaches to measuring and assessing learning, so that they better align with the values of incoming freshmen and also the learning abilities of new students. So let's talk about characteristics of today's incoming freshmen. Just as a quick reminder, here are how different generations are defined. And so Gen Z students are the ones who are currently college age or traditional college age. So they're typically born after 1996 and before the year 2013. And according to the literature, there's some important differences between Gen Zers and previous generations. So this book is one that I'd recommend. It's called Gen Z Goes to College. It's written by Corey C. Miller and Megan Grace. It was published in 2016, and this book is based on the findings from their 2014 study of over 1,000 Gen Ed or Gen Z students from 15 different institutions. In their book, they also cite over 300 additional sources, and then they translate their data into implications for today's instructors and college administrators. So here are some characteristics of Gen Z students that are mentioned in this book. Number one, they are very tech savvy. This book and many other sources reinforce that this generation of students really crave interactive, hands-on learning experiences that are driven by technology. This is actually the first generation of lifelong internet users. So they've been immersed in technology from a very young age. They're often described as digital natives. And according to one source, 98% of Gen Zers own a smartphone, which they check over 80 times a day. And so that's an important characteristic to keep in mind. They're also described as independent. They tend to be self-driven, and they really value flexibility and freedom, authenticity, a non-hierarchical leadership, and many sources also describe them as open-minded and responsible as well. They care about others. Like, they tend to be very aware of social issues. They're compassionate, they're thoughtful, they're loyal, and they value diversity. Another thing is that they value mental health. This specific generation reports struggling with mental health illness more than previous generations. In fact, only 45% say that their mental health is good. Anxiety and depression are really common among this group, and so that often bleeds into their education. They're also socially diverse, meaning that they have a more diverse friend group, more diverse friend groups than previous generations, but also nearly half of Gen Zers are either racial or ethnic minorities. So nearly 1 in 4 are Hispanic, 14% are Black, 6% are Asian, only 52% report being white. And all of them seem to report concern about racial or gender discrimination. One of their top concerns is finances. These students have grown up in the midst of economic downturn, and they have a lot of anxiety about being able to afford a college education. They had aversion to student loans, and they tend to want fewer comforts and more support during their college experience. So, for example, housing that's not without all the bells and whistles, as if they can trade that for more interaction with classmates and professors and advisors or tutors. And then a final characteristic that's listed in this book is that they're future focused. So they have a tendency to worry about their post-college employment and whether or not that will be long-term. 50% report being open to something other than a 4-year college degree, and so they're more open to the idea of trade schools or a gap year or apprenticeships or things other than a traditional 4-year college degree. So in terms of education, it's important to note that these students have different learning styles, a different set of academic skills, different social practices and priorities than previous generations. And they also tend to be self-reliant and prefer to self-educate, mostly because they're really familiar with Google and YouTube and TikTok and finding answers to questions. I also want to note that not all first-year students are Gen Z students. There are several non-traditional students who are returning to school, and this might be their first year back. They tend to be older, usually age 24 or older, and they may feel like they don't belong or they have a hard time connecting with younger students. They are typically financially independent from their parents, and because of that, they often attend college part-time and or they work full-time while they're in school. In many cases, they have dependents in addition to a spouse, so children or elderly parents or siblings that they're caring for. And then in some cases, non-traditional students have earned a GED instead of a high school diploma. They also may lack experience with literacy or math or technology and computer skills. That's not always the case, but sometimes. So here are some recommended teaching strategies and new ideas given the characteristics of many first-year students. According to the literature, these students, despite being highly connected to technology and social media, do report that they prefer face-to-face communication. Over 80% say that. However, they also really prefer to learn on their own time and in their own way, and so that's why an online format appeals to so many. Many also report that they don't like email. However, there are several sources that state that email is their preferred communication method, and 80% of them check their email at least once a day. And because of the world that we live in and the instant response with text messaging and other things, they often these students often expect quick feedback. We've talked about how they're more racially and ethnically diverse, and they expect us to be that way as well. And the mental health services are a priority for them. So I'm going to follow an ABC model to talk about some of the recommendations for reaching these students. So A is active learning, B is belonging, C is clarity, D is depth, E is examples, and F is flexibility. So let's go through a few of these. As I stated before, incoming freshmen seem to crave hands-on interactive learning, and so active learning is definitely a strategy to incorporate if you haven't done so already. There's a learning curve with active learning, and sometimes it's difficult to implement. Sometimes it's easier to stand up and just lecture, and yet there are so many benefits to including active learning in a classroom. So here are some resources and tools that I would recommend. I recently discovered this tool. It's a website, teaching.tools. It's a free resource developed by a team of people who are very familiar with the current literature on pedagogy and higher education, and so you can create lesson plans from this or put in learning objectives, but I really like this tool right here where you can find an activity, and they have this huge database where you can tell them how many students you have, how long your class period is, what you want in terms of an activity, like as far as a small group activity or a whole class activity, and it will generate a list of things to choose from. So that's been really useful. Another thing is books. Here are three of my favorite ones. James Lang wrote a book called Distracted: Why Students Can't Focus and What You Can Do About It. And he talks about the value of switching things up from lecture to active learning when you're teaching. hitting pause has lots of ideas for lecture breaks and things to do in a classroom environment. And then understanding how we learn talks about specific study skills and how you can implement those as a teacher and encourage students to try those out. Another important thing is belonging. First year students really need to feel that they belong in your classroom or at the institution, and that's often supported by the relationships that they make with either their peers or a professor. And so this is one of the highest priorities for freshmen. I really like this book called How College Works. And Chambliss, the author, came to Utah State actually several years ago, and I still remember his presentation. And he talked about how in a study that they did following 100 students post-graduation over 8 years, they determined that the most impactful thing that happened in college was the relationships that were formed with professors and peers. Even a small number of good friendships really made a significant difference in a student's academic performance, but also their social and mental health. One of the things that I've started doing and that I would recommend is to prioritize mental health from day one. I put it in my syllabus as a second paragraph, and you're welcome to borrow this paragraph or modify it as needed. But I want students to know that it's something that we value as instructors, and then we have a discussion early on in the semester about what that would look like in a classroom setting and how support would be offered. Also, the Office of Academic Belonging and Learning Excellence, or ABLE, has lots of ideas and resources on how to promote belonging in a classroom setting. So I recommend reaching out to them. C is clarity, meaning the more clear you are on instructions and a big picture map of your course at the beginning, the less confusion there will be for students and the more likely they'll be willing to engage. And here's something I really like: repeating patterns, meaning units that consist of the same number of assignments and about the same number of points, and it's the same length, and there's just this familiar current throughout your course. And if there's that pattern, then that makes students they have to guess less, and they become more confident, especially as they move through your course. I also really like having 1,000 points possible, so that it's easy for students to see how assignments are weighted and which ones are most important. And yeah, that's just a personal preference. D is depth, and so I think students really want a course that's rigorous and that will challenge them and stretch them. However, I noticed this article just the other day on KSL. It's a news article, and it talks about how sometimes failure is not always the best teacher. You know, students if something is too challenging or too confusing, then often they disengage. And repeated failure can also decrease the motivation to learn. And so these are quotes from that article. The take-home message is find ways to stretch students without breaking them. E would be examples. I have talked about this model a lot in previous presentations, but this is by research based on from Fisher and Frey, where they talk about the gradual release of responsibility. So early on, as a teacher, you're showing students what you expect, or you're walking through an assignment together or a process, and there's some guided instruction, and then you give them a chance to do it in small groups or with a partner before you have them do it independently on their own. I also like to model the 6 habits of highly successful students that this book talks about, and these 6 study strategies in a classroom setting so that students can start implementing those study strategies outside of class and in other courses. And so sometimes they don't realize that there are better ways to learn than just rereading things and highlighting things. And so if you're not familiar with these 6 strategies, then I would encourage you to check them out. Last is flexibility. And so find ways in your course where you can create a schedule for students where it's clear, where there's clear start and stop points, where there's opportunities to catch up or work ahead, and then offer options when you can so that they have more than one way to demonstrate learning. Also, I would encourage you to consider things like competency-based learning, benchmark grading, ungrading, a flipped classroom approach, and opportunities to revise and resubmit. And obviously, those things are going to look different in different courses. Here's a link to a source by Carrie Lamoureux from a previous ETE conference that continues to be one of my favorite sessions, and really emphasizes ways that you can make your course flexible. So once again, those ABCs are: A is active learning, B is belonging, C is clarity, D will be depth, E is examples, and F is flexibility. So let's end with some comments and feedback from first-year students. These came from Reddit, and the question was from a professor, and he said, "What do you wish your professors knew about you, and how could they help?" And so here are some comments. This comment focuses on saying, like, giving praise or positive feedback when you correct or critique work. The student says, "It may not seem like much to you, but one of my professors wrote 'good job' on one of my assignments, and it's still hanging on my wall at my home desk." So recognition for a job well done and or effort is really important. Second student says this: "I wish my professors knew that my bad grades were not because the content's hard, but because I really struggle with my mental health." And several students actually talked about mental health on this post. So this student wants professors to be willing to help and work with the student and talk about how that's going to work from the beginning of the semester. Another one, when you're, that was number 3, says, "Make students feel like they actually matter and have a voice." The student wants professors to ask for feedback from students. And they also said that they really value and do well in classes where there's freedom, options, and flexibility. Another student says that they appreciate it when there's formative assessment built into a course, so small quizzes and activities and assignments instead of only exams or projects that account for a large portion of their grade. Another student says, "I wish more professors understood mental health and how it impacts academics." They also say, "I'm not lazy, and it doesn't mean that I'm not a good student, so don't assume this. It just means that anxiety and depression are real for me." One recommendation that they have is to give students at least 2 free absences, one for emergencies, one for when they're just not feeling right mentally. Number 5 says, "I wish I could tell my professors about my struggles with health issues without sounding like I want sympathy." And so they're hoping that professors who have students who receive accommodations from the disability office will handle those with care and consideration. And another student with a disability is encouraging professors to learn about universal design and to recognize how little things like temperature or switching content or can be really challenging or make things inaccessible for students. And then the last one says, I wish my professors would talk more about things that they find interesting. I love it when a professor talks about a good documentary, an interesting article they found online, or books that they've read on a specific topic. I'm usually a pretty quiet kid in class who just performs well on assignments and tests, so this isn't something that I ask for, but I'm always curious to know about things that my professors find interesting, so that I can learn from those things too. I really do value what I learn. So I thought those were all helpful comments. Here's a list of resources and references that you can check out more, but that's all I have to share. Also, you're welcome to reach out to me for a copy of this PowerPoint or any other ideas that you want to talk about.